August 14th, 2005. A passenger jet is flying over Greece at 34,000 feet. Inside the cabin, 121 people. Not one of them is awake. The pilots are slumped in their seats. The flight attendants are unconscious in the aisle. The children are frozen in their chairs, leaning into their parents, who will never wake up again. And yet the plane keeps flying. Smooth, level, on autopilot. For 2 hours and 40 minutes, Helios Flight 522 is a ghost. When Greek F-16 fighter jets finally catch up to it over the outskirts of Athens, one of the pilots looks through the cockpit window and sees something he will never forget. He sees a man, alive, trying to save the plane. What happened in those 2 hours and 40 minutes? And why did one person inside that dying aircraft almost pull off the impossible? To understand the nightmare, we have to go back 36 hours before takeoff. The plane, a Boeing 737, has just landed in Larnaca, Cyprus. It's a routine flight, but one of the cabin doors is making a strange noise, a faint hiss, a leak somewhere in the seal. Ground maintenance pulls the plane into the hangar. They run a pressurization test, a test that checks whether the aircraft can hold pressure at altitude. And this is where the story of everyone on board starts to end. The engineer does something that looks completely normal, something that has been done thousands of times around the world. To run the pressurization test on the ground, he has to override the automatic system. So he moves a small switch in the overhead panel from auto to manual. He finishes the test, he signs the paperwork, and he forgets to move the switch back. One switch, 3 letters, auto, that is all. When the pilots board the plane the next morning, they don't notice. They run through their checklists, but the pressurization panel is not one of the items they verify in detail. The switch sits there, in manual, like a pin pulled out of a grenade. Takeoff. 830 hours local time. The aircraft climbs out of Larnaca into a clear Mediterranean sky. Nothing feels wrong. Nothing looks wrong. But with the pressurization set to manual and nobody commanding it, the cabin altitude begins to rise. Not the plane. The cabin. Imagine the air inside the cabin slowly thinning out. At 12,000 feet of cabin altitude, an alarm sounds in the cockpit. A horn. Sharp. Persistent. Here is the catastrophic detail. On the Boeing 737, that exact same horn is used for a completely different emergency on the ground. It's called the takeoff configuration warning, and the pilots, now already feeling the first effects of low oxygen, misidentify the sound. They think the plane has a problem with its takeoff systems, even though they are already at 14,000 feet. Hypoxia, the word for oxygen starvation, doesn't hit you like a punch. It seeps in. Your fingers get warm. Your judgment softens. You feel calm. You feel strangely good. And then you stop being able to understand what you're looking at. The pilots try to troubleshoot. Their radio calls start to slur. The captain opens a technical manual. The first officer asks a maintenance engineer on the ground, by radio, where exactly to find the pressurization switch. The engineer, hearing this, goes cold. He realizes. But it's already too late. By this point, everyone on board should be wearing an oxygen mask. The yellow masks have already dropped from the ceiling. The flight attendants should be shouting instructions. Passengers should be breathing from the emergency supply. But here is the thing that nobody in the general public knows about those yellow masks. The oxygen in them does not last forever. In a Boeing 737, the passenger oxygen generators burn for about 12 to 15 minutes. 12 minutes. The aircraft is still climbing. The pressurization is still set to manual, and the plane is heading for its cruise altitude of 34,000 feet, where the air is 4 times thinner than at sea level. When the 12 minutes run out, the oxygen in the cabin masks simply stops coming, and anyone who has not already fixed the problem is now breathing air that cannot support a human being. The last radio transmissions from the cockpit stop at 9:05 hours. After that, silence. Inside the cabin, 121 people quietly lose consciousness. Not dramatically, not with panic. They just stop being awake. The airplane, meanwhile, keeps doing exactly what it has been told to do. The autopilot holds the course. The autothrust holds the speed. The aircraft climbs to the altitude the pilots programmed before they blacked out. And then it flies. Toward Athens. On time, like a commuter flight. Except nobody inside is alive enough to notice. At 9:07, Greek air traffic control tries to contact Helios 522. No answer. They try again. Still nothing. The controllers assume a radio problem. It happens. But the plane is now crossing directly through the Athens terminal area without responding to a single instruction. And in 21st century Europe, a commercial airliner that does not respond is not a radio problem. It is a potential hijacking. 2 Greek Air Force F-16 fighter jets are scrambled from Nia Anchialos Air Base. Afterburners. They climb to intercept. And when they pull up alongside Helios 522, the pilots of the F-16s see something they cannot explain. The captain's seat is empty. Nobody is at the controls. The first officer's head is slumped forward over the yoke. There are passengers visible through the small oval windows, but they are still, motionless. The yellow oxygen masks are dangling in front of their faces, but the people behind the masks look like mannequins. The F-16 pilots radio back in a voice that shakes, something nobody trains for. The cockpit appears unmanned. They circle the plane. The autopilot keeps flying it in a perfect holding pattern over Athens. And then, movement. A figure enters the cockpit. A man, thin, pale. He pulls himself into the captain's seat. He puts on a portable oxygen mask. He tries the radio. His voice does not come through, but the F-16 pilots see his lips moving. His name is Andreas Prodromou. He is 25 years old. He is a flight attendant, not a pilot, not even close to a pilot. But here is the part that makes this story something different. Andreas Prodromou has a private pilot's license. He started flight training in small single-engine aircraft a year earlier because he loved airplanes. He was engaged to be married to one of the other flight attendants on this exact flight. She is currently unconscious somewhere behind him in the cabin. And because the last drops of emergency oxygen in the rear portable tanks kept him conscious a few minutes longer than everyone else, because by pure accident of where he was standing, the portable oxygen supply in the back galley lasted long enough for him to get a mask on his face, he is the only person on this aircraft still moving. Think about what this moment actually is. A 25-year-old in a flight attendant uniform, no commercial experience, no type rating on a 737, no simulator hours. He has been trained to serve drinks, demonstrate emergency procedures, open doors, not fly a jet. He walks through a cabin full of bodies, past his fiancée, past children still buckled into their seats, past colleagues he had breakfast with that morning. He pushes open the cockpit door, and he sits down in the captain's seat of an aircraft that has been flying itself, dead, for the better part of 3 hours. He knows something that the F-16 pilots don't yet know. He knows that the aircraft has almost no fuel left. He knows that the engines are going to quit. And he knows that if he does nothing, this plane is going to hit the ground somewhere between Athens and the Aegean Sea. And 121 people, including the woman he loved, are going to die. So he tries. For the next 9 minutes, Andreas tries to save 121 people. He grabs the yoke. He disconnects the autopilot. He banks the plane. On the ground, air traffic controllers watch his radar trace begin to move, and they realize for the first time that someone alive is still on board. But two of the engines are starting to die. The flight has now been in the air for over 2.5 hours. Fuel is almost gone. The aircraft is heading into terrain east of Athens, hills, trees, rock. Andreas keeps turning. He's looking for an airport. He's looking for any flat surface. He tries to contact someone, anyone, on the radio. The F-16 pilots try to coach him through hand gestures. He is responding. He understands. But he is not a pilot. And when one engine flames out and then the other, the plane starts to descend for the last time. At 10 past noon local time, Helios Flight 522 crashes into the hills near the village of Grammatico. Everyone on board, 121 people, is killed. Andreas Prodromou, the flight attendant who almost saved them, is the last one. Now, let's stop the story for a second. Because there is a reason I am telling you this crash, in this level of detail, on this channel. Every aviation disaster has a technical cause. A switch, a bolt, a piece of ice, a cracked bulkhead. Helios 522 had one. A pressurization selector left in the wrong position for 36 hours. But that is never the real story. The real story is always about how a chain of small, ordinary human decisions lined up perfectly until there was no way out. Helios had warnings. Real ones. Clear ones. Written in ink. 6 years before this flight, in October 1999, a private Learjet carrying American golfer Payne Stewart lost pressurization over the United States. The pilots did not notice. They lost consciousness. The autopilot kept flying. 4 F-16s intercepted that plane, too. They watched through the windows and saw the same thing the Greek pilots would see 6 years later. Frost on the glass, motionless bodies, no hands on the yoke. The Learjet flew for almost 4 hours before it ran out of fuel and crashed into a field in South Dakota. Everyone on board had been dead the whole time. Aviation learned from that, or it was supposed to learn. 4 years before Helios, in 2001, a Boeing 737 operated by a German charter airline suffered a pressurization problem almost identical to what would happen to Helios. The pilots figured it out. They put on their masks. They descended. The passengers survived. The airline filed a safety report. The manufacturer read it. Nothing was changed. The warning horn confusion, the fact that on the ground it means takeoff configuration, and in the air it means cabin altitude critical. That design flaw had been identified in internal Boeing documents years earlier. Pilots around the world had complained. The European Aviation Safety Agency had flagged it. Instructors in flight simulators had noticed how many trainees misdiagnosed the alarm. Nothing was changed. And when Helios 522's pilots heard that same horn at 14,000 feet, confused, oxygen-starved, hunting through a manual, they were the latest in a long line of humans being set up to fail by a system that had already been told exactly how it would fail. The pilots had been trained. The checklists existed. The hypoxia masks were there. Every single piece of the safety net was in place. And still, 121 people died over Greece on a calm morning. Because nobody, not the engineer, not the pilots, not the manufacturer, imagined that all of those pieces could fail at exactly the same time. And there is one more thing. After the crash, investigators combed through the wreckage. The flight data recorder survived. The cockpit voice recorder survived. And inside the cockpit voice recorder, in the final seconds before impact, they heard something. A man was speaking. He was saying, in Greek, a phrase that everyone who loses their family to aviation eventually learns by heart. He was calling for help. He was calling for air traffic control. He was calling his mother. And then the recording ends. If you want to understand how airplanes actually kill people, it is almost never because one thing went wrong. It is because everybody assumed somebody else was paying attention. The engineer assumed the pilots would catch it. The pilots assumed the alarm meant something else. The manufacturer assumed pilots would never confuse two identical sounds. Air traffic control assumed the radio was broken. 25-year-old Andreas Prodromou, a flight attendant who had spent a few weekends flying single-engine aircraft for fun, he was the only person in this entire chain who did not assume anything. He walked into that cockpit knowing nobody was going to save him, and he tried to fly the plane anyway. He is the reason we know what happened. There is one detail from the investigation that almost never makes it into the public reports. It's in the cabin pressure records. For about 20 minutes after the emergency oxygen masks ran out, the cabin altitude kept climbing toward the outside atmospheric pressure. At 34,000 feet, the air is so thin that unprotected humans lose consciousness within 30 seconds and die within minutes. By the time Andreas Prodromou walked into the cockpit, the air inside Helios 522 was essentially unbreathable, indistinguishable from standing on the outside of the plane at cruise altitude. He was functioning at Mount Everest oxygen levels with no acclimatization. Inside the cockpit, the F-16 pilots later described what they saw as Andreas tried to work the controls. His movements were slow, deliberate. He would reach for the yoke, then pause. Reach for the radio, then pause. He was fighting his own brain. Hypoxia at that altitude destroys fine motor control, short-term memory, and reasoning. Every action he took was taken through a fog that he could not push out of. The autopilot held the plane in a holding pattern over a navigation waypoint called KEA, a small island south of Athens. Andreas disconnected the autopilot. The plane dipped. He leveled it. The F-16 pilots, flying just off his wingtip, watched his hands grip the yoke, and they saw the left engine start to flame out. When a jet engine flames out, the plane does not fall immediately. It begins to glide. The airspeed drops. The rate of descent increases. On a 737, pilots have procedures, memorized by heart, to relight an engine after a flameout. Andreas did not know them, and at that altitude, inside that cabin, there was no way he could have performed them even if he did. He tried to turn the plane back toward Athens. He made a shallow right bank. The F-16s mirrored him. And when the second engine failed, about 7 minutes after the first, the aircraft became a glider carrying 121 bodies and one determined 25-year-old. Andreas kept trying. He was still trying when the hills near Grammatico came up through the windscreen. The Boeing 737 is still flying today. It is the most common airliner in the world. Every day, millions of people get on one without thinking. The pressurization system on a modern 737 has been redesigned. The warning horns have been separated. The checklists have been rewritten. All of that happened because of Helios 522. Every safety rule in aviation is written in blood. This one was written in the blood of 121 people over Greece on a clear August morning, and the flight attendant who refused to go quietly. If you want to know how the next accident will happen, don't look at the engines. Don't look at the weather. Look at the switches that are simple, the alarms that sound alike, the people who are too tired or too confident to check one more time. Every disaster you will ever hear about on this channel started exactly like Helios 522. Somebody, somewhere, forgot to flip one small switch back.